Hi friends, it's Aimee the Kitchen Witch, and today I have a little essay for you on the culinary anthropology of the apple. Specifically apple pie, right? So let's think about it. You know, America is going through a lot of growing pains these days, and we see people arguing over what is American and what America was like in the past and whether we want it to be that way again or not, and how we want the future to be. We're in this kind of like weird upheaval. And to be honest, this is not going to be a political rant. If you want me to rant on politics, feel free to follow me on Facebook or Instagram or anywhere else. I'm not shy about my opinions. But what we're talking about now is history, right? And like, really, what is as American as apple pie? Except apple pie, which isn't American at all. And, you know, with culinary anthropology, we're trying to study the history of foodways, right? Where foods came from, how they came to be, and then who moved those things from place to place. Like, everyone in the world, in the West, thinks salt and pepper, right? The two most basic things in the world, salt and pepper. Pepper is a very exotic spice. And we think of it as just kind of plain and boring. Vanilla is the same way. People are like, oh, that's so vanilla. Vanilla is like a fake seed pod from this orchid that only grew on certain mountains and only flowered once and could only be pollinated by like very specific bugs. Like, that's freaking amazing. And certainly not boring, but we have come to think of things as commonplace that are actually really fascinating. So if we're looking at foods that we think of as American, right, that belong to us, the saying, as American as apple pie, really only became part of our lexicon in the 1900s. Before that, we didn't consider apple pie that particularly American, mostly because people had a grandmother or a great-grandmother who may remember it from the old world. But just imagine for a second if you're biting into a steaming, delicious, ooey-gooey slice of apple pie and you're transported to a place, right? For most Americans, it's got to be grandma's kitchen or grandpa's kitchen or, you know, Auntie Susan's after church or, you know, some sort of childhood memory that we associate apple pie with. And we've all sort of grown up with this. My generation certainly has, as the most American of food. But anthropologically speaking, apple pie has really only been American for a minute. It's like, when we're looking at how this happened, it reminds me of a joke, right? This is one of my favorite anthropology, archaeology jokes. Why are the pyramids in Giza? Because they couldn't fit them in the British Museum. And we know that British colonialism really had a huge effect on most of the world in the West that we are familiar with. And they did a really good job of adopting the foods of the colonies that they took over and then creating, you know, sort of this like wholesome feeling of colonialism, even though it wasn't quite as delightful as most people would like you to think it was. So, you know, they took the best of the artifacts and the valuable bits and bobs of all of the people that they conquered. And America has done the same thing with the food of its immigrants. Sometimes completely erasing the immigrants themselves and their history by taking the food and sort of putting it into this culinary sleight of hand by stealing all of these flavors from all over the world, tossing them into a big melting pot, and serving up dishes that honestly they feel as native and wholesome and American as the Statue of Liberty herself, who ironically is in fact a foreigner and immigrated here from France. She is as French as croissants and baguettes, but not French fries. I'll explain that in a different essay. But first, let's talk about apple pie. So, y'all, apples, right? They aren't even native to America. When I grew up, I remember the story of, people and planting apples and Johnny Appleseed and all these things. But what I didn't really understand was that what we were learning was the history of colonization, and specifically how these Western tribes and people in America that were native and indigenous were having these new foods and new things thrust upon them. The idea that Johnny Appleseed ran around and was handing people apple seeds is actually really interesting, because we don't really think of that anymore as an invasive species. Apples are an invasive species, but technically they are. So with apples not even being native to America, the concept that being as American as apple pie is literally ironic, because apple pie itself is not at all American. And its roots stretch further back across the Atlantic than I expected. So the concept of an apple-filled pastry, it can be traced back to 14th century England. Sorry, someone was playing with my camera. You should go away. Can be traced back to 14th century England, where there was originally a recipe in a medieval cookbook called The Form of Curry. Now, curry in this instance meant spices. So it literally is saying the form of spices, or how to use spices, basically. And now in that particular cookbook, it was described as an apple tart. It was made with apples, figs, raisins, pears, all of those things, and then wrapped in a thick, inedible crust that was used more as a baking vessel than an actual part of the food. So way back in the 1300s, in lots of what is now Britain, they had one large oven that would be in the center of the village or the town. And fancy baking vessels and dishes and, Corningware casserole dishes just weren't a thing at that point. And the people would often, especially the poorer people who couldn't afford, fancy stone vessels or fancy ceramic vessels, would create a cast of mostly salt with a little bit of egg whites, sometimes some flour to bind it together. And they were creating vessels out of this. And then they would put the apples and all the things in it and put another layer of crust on top and seal it. And it's really like those salt dough ornaments that we made in elementary school when I was a kid. Does anyone remember those? I love those. I still make those with my kids. But when you baked it, it became this absolutely hard shell. So it wasn't any sort of edible thing. It was basically like one of those ornament things. But why would they do that? That's so weird, right? It was because it was creating sort of like a crock pot type cooking, sealing all of the moisture in, because once that thing baked hard, all of the moisture and juices from the apples would stay inside. And the people could take their pie, right? Or what we think of now as, sort of like their little crock pot, but they would take their pie to this bakery. And it would just be usually open air right in the middle of either the town square or the town center. And there would be a baker, usually a man, who would run it. Now, the reason why it was run by a man was because gender really played a huge part in everybody's lives and their daily roles in that time and place. So the women would make the food and bring it to the oven, but they couldn't run the oven because that was a job. And so the baker who was working in the oven would typically be a man. And they would give him their pies or their bread or whatever they needed to bake. And the baker would put it in the oven. Now his job would be to make sure it didn't burn, to rotate things so that it cooked evenly, and then to have them ready and waiting when the women were finished with whatever work they were doing that day to come out and come back for them. Now, if you stop and think about it, you've actually heard this story before, but in a much simpler version, and you were probably skipping rope at the time. And that is pat a cake, baker's man, bake me a cake as fast as you can, roll it, pat it, and mark it with a B, and put it in the oven for baby and me. Or put it with a T for Tommy and me, or whomever you might have had a crush on back then. And that was the song, right? And it was actually historically accurate because originally, the first time that song was recorded in writing, it was in a slightly different form, but it was in a play by D'Urfey in 1698. Okay, so we're still talking a couple hundred years after that first cookbook was published with the recipe in it, but we're still in that same era. And then as time went on, it was immortalized in Mother Goose's Melody in 1765, and then has slowly evolved over time into what we're familiar with now. So keep in mind that the word cake, pat a cake, in this particular instance, probably doesn't mean what we think of as a cake. But that's also another essay for a different day. So we're talking about a society that was mostly illiterate, right? In Britain in the 1300s to 15, 16, 17, into the 1800s, most people were not literate. They could not read. And so the baker couldn't just make notes like Sarah's pie is on the left. So what they would do instead is have each woman or family would have a particular way that they would crimp their dough, or that they would make a particular mark. We saw this a lot in the ranches out west during the American expansion into the West, where a ranch would be called, triple circle. Because when they put their mark on something, they would put 3 circles. You didn't have to read to know this belonged to the triple circle ranch. Well, maybe Marge braided her pies on the edges, or, maybe Mary crimped her edges funny. And everyone in the village would know who that pie belonged to by the shape of the decoration, because they couldn't mark it in any other way. That has lasted up until very recently. Like, how did your grandmother fix her pie edges, right? Did she crimp it with a fork and smash around the edges? Did she do that trick with the spoon to get perfect flutes? Or did she crimp it with her thumb and fingers and get those ruffly edges? Those are very popular now because they're easy to do with a machine. But what was your family's style? That was important. And it was very important up until recently because, if you went to a potluck, you were looking for the pie that had the little fluted crimped edges, because that means Mama Smith made it, and that's the good pie, right? So these actually have lasted for generations. It's something that's sad that I think a lot of us have lost now what our original family design would have been, right? I don't know. I wish I did. But it's definitely something that has lasted up until very recently. My grandmother definitely could recognize her own grandmother's pies. That was definitely a thing. So now that we've made it into the villages of medieval Britain, if we look at that, it really kind of looks like an apple stew, right? It's inside an inedible crust. It's basically like a crock pot with apples and sweet things inside it. Now, keeping in mind, it didn't have sugar because sugar came over from the New World. And so it would have been sweetened with honey or other dried fruits or, They could make juniper honey. There were different ways to sweeten things, but it wouldn't be what we expect our ingredients to be now. But if we move forward across the channel and a couple hundred years into the future, then we know Dutch bakers in the 1500s took this iconic dessert that had been popularized for hundreds of years, and they took it to the next level because they didn't need to have ovens out in the countryside, in the village square, whatever. Most of these homes, and part of it is because they were a little colder areas that these houses were, that we're talking about, were built in, would actually have not only the hearth and big chimney, they would probably have a baking box inside the chimney. So it would be something like this, but with a little hole cut in it that had a little door. You could bake right in it. Your original indoor oven. And that meant that they didn't have to worry about things drying out in the same way that you would have had to worry about in the 1300s in Britain. Because if you have this giant fire oven burning peat moss or wood or something, and you're dropping your pie off, and then you have to go spend, a few hours doing your own life stuff, milking cows and, whatever your life looks like back then, and then come back and get it. So it needed to be something that wouldn't go bad or wouldn't burn. So the outside crust wasn't edible, mostly because it wasn't going to be edible at the end of the day anyway. So with the Dutch, they were able to look in and check it out, and they had what they called an apple tart, and it was very much like what we are starting to think of as we get through time to our apple pies. They were the ones who created the lattice on the top. The cool thing about the lattice was that it allowed it to cook more quickly because it wasn't in this big hard salt dome, and it allowed steam to evaporate so that the edible pastry wouldn't just kind of turn into gooey dumplings. It allowed that crispy texture. And their pastries were definitely more often made with butter or lard and flour that was usually ground at home by hand, so it wouldn't have been fine white flour, but it was much more similar. And then we have to think about, why? Why was this important, right? Why was it important to switch this one thing, right, this apple pie, from being baked in this hard shell into a pastry? And then it obviously moved into being more easily accessible to the people at home. As soon as people started building houses with their own ovens and their own, the Industrial Revolution changed a lot of things for a lot of people. And being able to bake in your house was one of those things. For many, many years, people couldn't bake in the house. They could have a fire, maybe they had a pot, they could heat water for tea or a tincture or whatever. But we're not talking about big, serious ovens the way we have today. So seeing it move from the inedible crust to the delicious flaky crust that we have now is actually watching how humans over time really raise above adversity, right? It's really cold outside. I need a fire. I need to cook things. Maybe I can use the same fire for both of those things. So human ingenuity has a lot to do with the actual evolution of apple pie. So when we think about it, the next time you dig into that slice of apple pie at Thanksgiving dinner or at grandma's house on Sunday, just take a second, breathe it in. Think about all of the hands and the hearts and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of women and men who have come before you and who have created over time this amazing thing that we think of as belonging to us, right? We Americans are like, it's American as apple pie. Hate to tell you, bro, it ain't that American. So the question really is, all right, where did apples come from then? If we have the first written recipe with apples in the 1300s in Britain, and a lot of that is just because we don't have a lot of written recipes from before then anyway. There are some, and there's a wonderful website that I'll put a link to if you're actually interested in historical recipes. But seriously, take a guess, all right? Take a second and think about it. Where do apples come from? I'm guessing, unless you're asking Uncle Google, you have no idea, because I didn't either. They actually show in studies that apples are indigenous to the Chiang Mai Mountains of Kazakhstan, which is in Asia, Central Asia. Kazakhstan. Nope. I did not have that one on my Apple Apocalypse bingo card. I didn't see that one coming. But the plant that the apple has evolved from was called the Malus sieversii. Yes, I mispronounced that horribly. I apologize. Latin, while being something that I am forced to occasionally read, is not something I speak. So anyway, we have Kazakhstan, and now we're getting into the exciting stuff. Like, this is the exciting part for me, right? We have apples, but we have apples in the Paleolithic time. Okay, we're talking about literally 750,000 years ago, when the humans, or the humanoids who were in Kazakhstan, were able to feed themselves by being hunter-gatherers, right? So they wandered through the woods. They would cultivate, if there's a tree, they would eat from the tree. Don't take too many apples, because then there won't be apples next year, right? Like, that's what I mean by cultivating. The hunters and the gatherers learned how to husband their resources so that they wouldn't just deplete them quickly. So that means these little sour crab apples, which are the original apples, were just growing wild in the forest. They were part of the life of a hunter and gatherer. And that lasted for thousands and thousands of years. We're talking like almost 700,000 years. So during that time, the apples would have spread slowly, because the hunter-gatherers would have traveled with the seasons. Typically, they would have had, a common route, common areas that they would go. So maybe, they would take some apples with them as they were traveling, or they would, maybe throw a few seeds in their pocket. When they stop, boom, that's what happens. Seeds, right? That's how plants take over the world. And also bird poop. Bird poop has a huge effect on the migration of plant matter, especially fruits and vegetables. And I can't tell you enough that this is why I self-publish, because honestly, what publisher wants you to talk about bird poop in the middle of a food essay, right? But let me tell you, those birds, they're migrating some stuff around. That's, if you've ever planted a fence, you know that for sure. Truth, fact. Wow, all of those words tried to come out at the same time. Okay, so let's move on to another time period, literally another eon, right? So we're 750,000 years ago, and now we're moving up through time to the Neolithic farmers, right? So that's putting us around 8,000 years ago, and those Neolithic farmers, right? This is sort of the beginning of the real farming, cultivating community. And they started cultivating those wild apples into orchards and developing them into different growth areas and working them into their gardens and actually farming them in a way that had not been done for hundreds of thousands of years before that, because this is the era in which people started to understand farming more. And so apples really have been one of the original cultivated orchard fruits that we have any evidence of. All right, so, that was 8,000 years ago. Now we're jumping back up through time. And apple seeds would have been carried all throughout Asia, but into Europe and northern Africa by about 1500 BCE, right? So this is before the Common Era. So now we're at about 3,500 years ago. And that would have been part of the big spice trade, right? We've talked about spice routes and how Marco Polo went from, one place to another and brought all kinds of things, pepper and cocoa and chocolate and all of the things that people like to talk about. So here we are. We know that apples traveled into Europe about 3,500 years ago. And the reason why they were so popular was because they can keep for a long time. Apples in a cool, dry environment can last for months, especially the smaller, harder apples. So they could dehydrate them as well and carry them dehydrated. We've all had a piece of apple leather, right? And when they got where they were going, they could throw them in a pot and rehydrate them into a soup or a stew or a snack or porridge or whatever. So apples were perfect for taking with you on a trip. And not only were the apple seeds valuable because they could grow in many different climates, you could carry the fruit and then eat it and then save the seeds and then plant the seeds when you got where you were going, but also apple seeds were a great way to produce cyanide, which was a very common poison at some point in time. It takes about 600 apple seeds crushed up and boiled down into a very thick gloop and then dried and ground up, and now you have cyanide. And this is exactly why I'm pretty sure my research has put me on at least a few watch lists. So, hi, Big Brother. Yep, it's me talking about apples, cyanide. So, now, moving up through time again into the modern era, the Romans brought those apple seeds and even little trees with them. There is some record of them actually bringing saplings across to the British Isles during the early Christian era, right? So the early Christian era is from about 700 Common Era to 325 Common Era. Because after that, Caesar Constantine got involved and whatever. Whatever. F you, Caesar Constantine. So the Romans were on the European continent, and they were very partial to taking their apples and simmering them in mead or honey or specifically wine over there. But the wine the Romans drank was different than the wine we drink today. It was very sweet, and it was also usually sweetened with juniper sugar, which can be made from dehydrating juniper berries, etc., etc. So it would have tasted like a very sweet gin. It had that florally herbal flavor that gin has. So if you think about it, boiling apples in gin actually sounds delicious. I might try that. But it was a different flavor profile than what they were going to have once they moved across to the British Isles, because I don't know if you've been anywhere in the British Isles, but I can tell you right now, grapes do not grow that well in Scotland or in Wales or in England. It's just not really a grape kind of area. I mean, you can grow muscadines and there are great varietals, etc., but we're not talking Tuscany here. So what are they going to do with them now? Well, now they're going to have to think about, okay, do we cook it with honey? Do we cook it with mead? Do we cook it with ale, which was very popular? Sugar wasn't a thing at the time. So the beginning of these pies, what we consider sweet as humans now, would have been 1,000 times sweeter than they would have been able to produce then, because they didn't have the same ingredients that we have now. A lot of time back in the before times, from medieval previously, a lot of sugar, what they would call sugar or even honey, was actually made from dates. Dry the dates, pound it up, you have date sugar. Boil the dates and add some water and cook them down into syrup, you had date honey. So when you hear like the land of milk and honey, they were talking about the dates, mostly because there weren't bees there at the time. Anywho, so the flavor profile of what we are starting to think of as apple pie would have changed greatly when it crossed from Roman times over in Europe over into Britain, and simply because all of the other ingredients that they had to add to it were different. And while the Romans would have brought some wine, they probably weren't bringing enough wine just to boil apples in, because then the alcohol disappears. What fun is that? So moving up a few more hundred years, by the time the European settlers were starting to trundle their way across the waves to the new colonies, they were bringing apples with them, because a huge barrel of apples could absolutely cross the Atlantic over, a few months and both be used as food during the trip and when they landed, but also they carried their seeds with them. So they brought lots of different varieties of apples to North America. But the problem is, what does that mean? Varieties, right? The interesting thing is, every time an apple seed is planted, it grows into a totally unique variety of tree, okay? That's because apples have this weird scientific characteristic known, I'm reading this, so pardon me, as extreme heterozygosity. Heterozygosity, okay? Which means that an apple grown from seed is not like its parents. It has literally multiple zygotes, it can pull from more than one parent. So every apple produces seeds, and inside those seeds is the genetic DNA of every other apple tree that was blooming anywhere near it, that any butterfly, bee, bird, or little boy shook some pollen and got pollen from one tree to another. That's it. Every single one. So when you talk about Granny Smith apples, unless you've been to Granny Smith's house, you've never had a real Granny Smith apple. And interestingly, Granny Smith apples, they originated in New South Wales, Australia in 1868, which is not as far back as I thought it would be, considering how popular they are. They were discovered by Maria Ann Smith, who noticed a seedling growing in her compost pile and was like, oh, look, there's a tree. And that's it. Now we call any tart green apple a Granny Smith apple. But let me just end by saying this. Y'all better stop taking Granny Smith's name in vain. Those are not her apples.